We are starting the consulting seminars on the topic care and welfare in post-socialist Eurasia, and we have here the great specialists in welfare and well-being, Professor Linda Cook, and during our first seminar we will discuss about social movements. So, dear Linda, we can start, I guess. Please follow the flow is yours.
Okay. Elena, do you want to do an introduction or no?
Just maybe a few words. Linda is our scientific advisor of our lab, and she was with us from the very beginning, since 3 years ago. During the first 3 years period, we worked together in several projects and implemented several research ideas and published several journals together and chapters in a book, in some books. So Linda has participated in many of our seminars, and thank you very much for supporting us, for your invaluable help and commitment. It always inspires and gives us strength, and yes, and we have the pleasure to have you here in our team. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, I find working with you inspiring as well. All right, so today we're going to discuss a paper. The focus of the seminar is this paper by, I'm sorry, I don't want to mispronounce your name. She got Gosh on some social movements in Bangladesh. So I'm going to start out by talking for just a few minutes about what social movements are. And there have been really 4 stages of development in the sociological theory of social movements. And I'm going to very briefly talk about those. The paper itself talks about 2 of them. And then we will go on to the paper itself. So just for basic definition, what a social movement is, it's an organized effort by a significant number of people to change or to resist change in some major aspect of society or policy, social policy in this case. These 2 cases were efforts to change a quota system for government jobs in the paper and a movement in favor of road safety. So they are social movements, are purposeful, they're organized forms of collective behavior, but they're not formal organizations, they're not political parties, they're looser and usually more temporary networks of individuals. They may include a number of other organizations that existed before and will exist after them. They may make connections with political parties or members of government, but these movements themselves are neither organizations nor parties nor parts of government. They're individuals, groups, and organizations that comprise a social movement, are united by common goals and concerns that involve them in common action. They operate outside the regular political channels of society. That is, they don't rely primarily on elections or campaigning or supporting political candidates, but they may penetrate deeply into the political process as interest groups. They may be revolutionary or reformist, but they have in common active organization of a group of citizens to change the status quo. Sociologists have usually been concerned to study the origins of such movements, their sources of recruitment, their organizational dynamics, goals, norms, and their impact on society. So the social scientists began by trying to find some explanation for why these social movements emerge. You know, they're not institutions, they emerge at some particular point in time. I wouldn't say exactly spontaneously, but they emerge and they address the issue or the concern that they are devoted to, and then usually they disperse. So the first efforts to explain why these movements emerged in societies, these were in the past, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, they basically looked at discontents, grievances, and people like Durkheim, Seymour Martin, Lipset, Marx, had kind of what were called mass society explanations. Their theories were that when large numbers of people became discontented or alienated, often because of large-scale changes in society, on the basis of their organization or their discontent, they would mobilize and bring pressures for change. Lipset and Durkheim talked particularly about the alienating conditions of mass society and how they produce discontent. In these actors, the first group looked at psychological factors in particular, mediated by social conditions. They saw this behavior of groups as somewhat irrational, as driven by psychological dissatisfactions and alienation, people reacting to abrupt changes in social structures or social breakdown. They were a kind of crowd behavior. So in these early theories, the sources were really in the psychologies and experiences of individuals who came together because of their discontents in a really irrational kind of mass movement or crowd. Okay, the next kind of stage of this kind of explanation was Marxism, which was quite a bit more specific. Marx and Marxists theorized that people would come together in movements, in collective action, not just randomly because they were individually dissatisfied, but there groups of people in Marxist theory, the working class, would experience grievances, and they would experience these grievances, growing immiseration collectively. And at some point they would come to a common consciousness that they wanted to change the society, and then they would rise up. Marx was not totally unconcerned with the role of organization and leadership, but he mainly saw this movement as kind of spontaneous, as coming out directly from the experience in realized discontents and consciousness of these mass groups in society. And there were also one more group, the relative deprivation theorists, of whom Ted Gurr is the most famous. These people realized, or Gurr realized, that collective movements don't usually come from the bottom of society. They don't come from the people who are poorest and who, in a common sense meaning, should be most aggrieved. They come from people somewhere in the middle. And so Gurr said we get collective action when people, a large group of people are experiencing an improvement in their living conditions, and then there's suddenly a decline. So those are the kind of psychologically based theories, or in Marx's case, more a consciousness-based theory. So those theories were prominent for a while, and then a new group of people came along and said, well, that's only a very small part of the explanation. Grievances are everywhere. Lots of people have them. There's massive poverty. There are all kinds of discontents in society, but they usually don't produce social mobilization, social movements. In order for them to do that, they have to be more than grievances. Those grievances have to be organized and mobilized. So they began to focus on the resources, on leadership and resources of these as the major factor in explaining which grievances were mobilized into actual social activism. They focused on the needs of these organizations to mobilize resources, looked at the range of resources that they had to mobilize groups, how they were deployed, the collective actions by which authorities might attempt to limit their resources. Within this perspective, the word resources took on a wide array of meanings. And this is one of the theories that is reviewed but not ultimately used in the paper. So within this perspective, resources can mean economics, they can mean ideologies, rhetoric, symbols, not only resources in a physical or financial sense, also soft resources, leadership, communication networks, available time and money, political connections, allies outside the movement, particularly powerful allies in government or in political parties or media, could be critical. And of course, now when people look at collective action, the role of social media is especially important. That came on the scene after these theories, but you can see that the possibilities for communication become much, much greater. Leaders must assign tasks and take responsibility for decisions about how resources are used. So the fundamental claim of the resource mobilization theory is that protest is not an automatic response to grievances or discontent. It really all relies, whether grievances become mobilized and how effectively and how much change they make, really depends on strategic calculations in leadership and tactics, depends on human agency. I would say, although he was never credited for it, in a way, Lenin was the first resource mobilization theorist. He took Marx and he said, well, okay, these grievances are there, but leadership and organization is critical to their being mobilized and becoming effective. So it seems to me that he saw the fundamental insight of the resource theorists that organization and leadership were absolutely critical. Okay, so the resource theorists dominated for a while, and then more people looked at this, more political scientists, particularly a man named McAdam, looked at these theories and said, well, wait a minute, it's not just grievances, though people have to have authentic felt grievances. It's not just organization, though organization is necessary. Two other factors matter that are more political. One of them is what he called the political opportunity structure. Okay, there are some conditions because these groups, this collective action is addressed at power holders, at governments. Factors characterizing those governments also matter. If a government is extremely repressive, and as soon as any collective action begins, it's going to send the police or the military against it, people don't have the opportunity to organize. That seems obvious, but it was not theorized in the earlier approaches. On the other hand, if a government is open or democratic or vulnerable, if, for example, in Bangladesh, elections were going to be held not long after these collective actions, then the government is concerned to satisfy people, not to create more grievances and opposition. That opens opportunities. It's better to try to have collective action when your government wants to be responsive than when you know it's going to be repressive. So there's the central role of political factors, political opportunities, socio-political circumstances, that they can provide opportunities or they can present obstacles. And I want to say this political process model is the one that is used in the paper to explain the mobilization of these two social movements and also their relative success. So social movements are not just about entrepreneurial calculation, they're also about politics. And okay, a political environment, divisions within elites, divisions between elites can be particularly important. If two sets of elites are competing and one of them can build support by making concessions to a mobilized group, that's another kind of opportunity that the group can have. Political system may expand or contract incentives. And then there is a third factor, which is called framing. And that's also included in the political process model. So there are three elements in this model. There is still resources, organization, strength of leadership matters, political opportunity matters, but also this theory, this political process theory, also introduced the idea of framing. It's very important for movements. how their demands are conceptualized, how they're justified, how they're presented to people. You have the leaders to be successful, they have to construct meaning, a symbolic discourse that is persuasive to a large number of people. They need to create a narrative of injustice. So there are psychological and cultural dimensions to mobilization. In a way, this theory brings together everything. The early psychological theories that focus on individual motivations to participate, the organizational factors, and also the broader structural factors out there in the political environment. There's one more kind of theory of social movements, what's called new social movements. That's not entirely distinct, but it's different in its emphasis. So the new social movements theory focuses much more heavily on this issue of framing, of how to appeal to people. It's not just organizations, it's how they motivate people, and they motivate people by finding messages, justifications, by finding ways of defining injustice that are compelling to large numbers of people. This theory, new social movements, it focuses more on identity and values. Examples are feminism, environmentalism, broad kinds of identities around which people mobilize. It's constructivist. It takes reality as something that exists only once it's constructed conceptually. It stresses the symbolic aspects. It's necessary for leaders to persuade many people that a situation requires remedy. It's a carefully constructed message that appeals to emotions. So again, the psychological dimension is back. It appeals to anger, injustice, indignation, empathy. The motivational framing is very important. An injustice frame is usually key to social movements. So as much as you need leadership in organization, people need a compelling message, a persuasive interpretation, that something that has often been accepted for a long time, like contamination of the environment or different rights for women, is in fact unjust, and they have to find a convincing way of getting people to recognize that this is an injustice, even though it may have been the status quo for a long period of time, in that it's an injustice around which they need to mobilize in order to change it for their own sake, and often also for the broader collective sake, as in environmentalism. It's this identity, according to new social movements, is crucial in order to produce solidarity among members, this consciousness of a common struggle or cause. So organizers have to create this shared understanding of work that legitimates and motivates collective action. And those are the three main explanations that we have. And I think now we will go on to the paper, Conceptualizing Social Movements in Bangladesh post-2013, a qualitative and comparative case study of the quota reform movement in road safety. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Linda, for this comprehensive introduction into the realm of social movements theories, various paradigms and their limitations and interconnectedness. And now we will give the floor to Shoykot for a short presentation of his paper, summary of his paper, and then yes, everybody, I think maybe Arnab will start commenting, and then everybody can also ask questions and comment. Okay, Shoykot, please, you can share the screen or just talk. Whatever.
Unfortunately, I don't have any PowerPoint slides. It's just I will talk if that's all right.
No, it is not all right. You should now immediately make the slides. It's a joke.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, okay, please just summarize your main ideas.
Thank you very much, and thanks for giving me this opportunity to present my paper in front of my esteemed colleagues. Now, I studied two movements as case studied, and just to lay a little bit of background, there has been presence of mass grievances and moral indignation against the political elite and the elite class. The social movements in Bangladesh in the last decade have been very few and have failed to transform the increasingly authoritarian and very claustrophobic political milieu. So, the country has not seen many movements, and again, there has been serious mass grievances on social, political, and economic issues, and this situation kind of poses a sort of paradox. And in this context, I studied two significant social movements that happened during that period after 2013. And again, as Dr. Cook said, that I used a device from political process theory to conceptualize these movements. Now, those two movements, one movement is demanding reform against the extent system of quota that prohibited many deserving individuals from accessing the public service sector and university by allocating 56% of government employment to a very few selected groups. And the second movement, and another movement, the movement named road safety movement. It was a series of protests advocating improved social safety. The protest was sparked by deaths of two high school students in city of Dhaka, struck by a bus operated by an unlicensed driver who was racing to collect passengers. And this incident impelled students to demand safer roads and stricter traffic laws, and demonstration rapidly and spontaneously spread throughout the country without any organizational structure whatsoever. So now the movements in Bangladesh, particularly in the history of the country, has most of the time impacted by students' involvement. In fact, the biggest, some of the biggest events of the country were led by student movements, namely the liberation war against Pakistan back in 1971 was heavily involved by and led by particularly by students. So now as Professor Cook, that I reviewed why I choose political process theory to conceptualize these movements, these two case studies. I reviewed resource mobilization. It gives, actually, political process theory complements resource mobilization in many ways. Now, resource mobilization defines social movements as logical groups of politically active individuals who places a strong emphasis on the value of resources. And according to the theory, when some members of a society have particular grievance, they might be able to gather the resources needed to take action and to address those. Now, in this sense, as Dr. Cook also said, resources refers to things like funds, activists, members, social status, education, and so on. It also takes account into account the result of outside actors and circumstances, moving beyond social pressure as the only root cause of development. Now, social movements are no longer seen as monolithic actors. Instead, they're made up of several social movement organizations. And these organizations are crucial for allocating resources and enabling social movement to encompass more than merely protest. The gap here is the power of social movement organization to resources were stressed nevertheless, and this paradigm acknowledged the rationalism of movement entrepreneurs, but the masses were not given the same weight as the elites. Resource mobilization theory succeeded in explaining changes dominated by elites, but sometimes fell short explaining changes dominated by marginalized people. In this circumstance, a more dynamic theory is required to adequately understand the complexity of the movement that I am taking in this study. Political process theory is that the political process theory is utilized because of that. According to the political process theory, particular yet external socio-political circumstances shape an entity's organizational behavior, traits, actions, and relative impact. While complementing resource mobilization in many regards, political process theory was put forward by sociologists to accentuate a different yet vital component of social structure that is crucial for the development of social movement, which was up until now missing, that is political opportunities. So this theory entails, I used 3 explanatory elements to conceptualize those. Political opportunities, mobilizing structure, and framing process. Now, political opportunities are political and institutional opportunities that have the ability to either support or impede collective behavior. And this theory frequently emphasized the possibility of both open and closed political options, both of which might lead to mobilization, lead to movements. Sidney Thoreau actually defined political opportunity more dynamically as consistent, but not necessarily formal, or as a permanent dimension of the political struggle that encourage people to engage in contentious politics. And it alludes to a group of external opportunities that are comparatively steady, but nonetheless dynamic enough to alter the incentives offered by the accessible political space. And this opportunity, political opportunity, takes into account the degree of repression, the level of political liberty, political openness, and the existence or lack of elite allies, and so on. Not only political opportunity is a necessary condition for a movement to emerge, it affects the movement's behavior, structure, strategy, and results, consequence. So it has a sort of reciprocity, reciprocal relation. It has been suggested that social movements can affect political opportunities as a dependent variable as well. So it appears that there's a complex and interacting relations between political opportunity and social movements. Now, going to mobilizing structure, it originally proposed by Doug McAdams as indigenous organizational strength. Now it reinterpreted as mobilizing structure. This partially aligning with resource mobilization theory, mobilizing structures primarily refer to the organizations that are already extant within the community that wants change, by providing members, leadership, communication, social networks. These organizations act as mobilizing institutions for mobilizing for movements, for social movements. Not only the existing organizations, mobilizing structures in a more explanatory manner, in a more elaboratively, are those collective vehicles, maybe formal or informal, through which people mobilize and engage in collective action. So it incorporates not only the pre-existing groups, but also movement organizations and informal networks among potential activists. So that way, mobilizing structure challenged the collective behavior theories assertion on the spontaneity of movement and elevates collective action to the status of planned, more structured and deliberate process. Now, framing process is very important, and that's what I showed in try to show in my study that were the difference or make those movements comparatively less successful than the other. Leaders engage in framing process to enable the group or movement to identify the current issues first, explain why change is required, specify the changes that are sought, and explain how one may go to action, go about attaining them in a clear and very persuasive manner. So it also evolved from originally proposed by Doug McAdams as cognitive liberation, which was centered on a personal sense of empowerment. Now, this framing process rather accentuate the more strategic decisions made at a higher organizational level as a continuous dynamic process. By focusing on how members of social movements construct a common narrative of injustice. So, and the important thing is, instead of existing independently, these three components of political process theory, they interact, they reciprocate, and play different roles at various points in time. And it deems that these three components not only necessary but also sufficient to explain movements emergence from emergence to decay. Now, briefly, why these two movements? The first movement, I studied the case of quota reform movement. Again, it started as spontaneous process, and we have to bear in mind that before 2018 movement, there were many protests in earlier years, but those movements never got to their goal. They never reached their goal. So it started as peaceful protests, which turned chaotic and violent. Both of the movement faced both state and non-state sponsored repression, violence, which both of those stood in a different way against those violence. Now, a collective sense of grievance against the quota system and an insurgent consciousness has always been prevalent in the country. But what catalyzed the 2018 movement to emerge? Part of the answer lies into the component of political process theory. The 2018 was the election year. So in the midst of a looming legitimacy crisis, due to the lack of credibility of the result of previous elections in 2014 and ruling Awami League government characterized as authoritarian, nevertheless was seemingly set on remaining in power. Looking at the history of the country's student-led movements, which have always been a systematic relation against any authoritarian rule, a movement like this, which already had moral support from vast people, could conceivably transform into a larger move against the ruling party that could subvert the authority. Now, one of the main reasons previous protests being unsuccessful prior to 2018 is due to the lack of proper framing. In previous protests, the only demand was the abolishment of the quota system, which in public imagination stamped as anti-liberation. Anti-liberation in the sense 1971 liberation war of independence in Bangladesh, and very selfish, since freedom fighters were still the most respected people in the country in public memory for their glorious sacrifice. And some portion of quota was preserved for the children of the freedom fighters. Now, this time, the protesters demanded reform, not abolishment. So there's this clear, concise framing. They clearly outlined 5 movements demanded where they precisely articulated what changes are required. Prior to that, the leaders, before the demand, the leaders persuasively, which is another, again, important part of framing process. The framing should be persuasive. The demand should be persuasive. They persuasively delineated the problem with the existing quota system through various platforms. Mainly, they had a Facebook page with 3.5 million members that essentially turned out to be the real spokesperson of the movement, and managed to create a strong discourse in mass public perception. Learning from the previous events, the movement strategically set itself as pro-liberation, pro-Awami League, pro-government, and they chanted different slogans, kind of pro-government slogans. This advanced the ideological buy-in to some extent among the government sympathizer students. In the emerging stage of the movements, the initial leaders managed to appoint some influential students from the student wing of the party of the which is in the government right now. Now, this framing process were not only important to motivate collective action, but also are much crucial to seize political opportunities. So there we can see the reciprocity between these elements. Now, the mobilizing structure of this movement played a very significant role behind its success. The movement started to get its momentum after it came up with an organizational structure. A convener committee, there was a convener committee in earlier of the protests. Students started to gushing into the protests onwards. And that committee spearheading the platform and being the co-organization providing with main leadership that led the movement. There were many sub-organizations heavily contributed with participation in the protests. Those sub-organizations worked as constant pressure group to central leadership not to leave the streets until the movement reached its goal. So the movement has a strong and efficient leadership who were after being brutalized numerous times by both state and non-state violence, never left their ground. They stood their ground. They were on the street. This courage and perseverance of the leadership not only channelized into the protesters to stand strong in their goal, but also helped to create a positive public sentiment toward the movement. The movement's strong organizational structure is evidential in its networking across the country, separation of tasks. Now, there were different activists appointed with different responsibilities on and off the ground. So since contemporary movement heavily rely upon virtual social networking sites, these movements had their team on social networking managers on Facebook who were assigned to screening the comments and constantly shared their views and news of the movement in their page, in the Facebook page. So now we can see that the movement reached to a hiatus after Prime Minister's declaration of abolishing the quota system, but seeing no tangible income. At one point of time, there were some token promises. With the token promises, movement were at one point bit of withered away. But after seeing no implementation of that promises, the protesters returned to the street with an ultimatum and hold the ground until succeeded. Now, why this happened? This attributed to this movement's, quota reform movement's strong mobilizing structure. Now, on the other hand, the case for road safety movement. Two students of one certain school were hit by speeding bus that plowed into a bus stop on a road leading out in a place in Dhaka. While students were attempting to board a bus that had stopped in the middle of the road, another racing bus with excessive speed, competing for more passengers, lost control and ran over the students and killing 2 and injured 12 people. Now, outraged by the death of their fellow classmates, it was very spontaneous. The students flocked into the streets and set up barricades on the roads. The grievance further intensified. There was a momentum where this movement also had these two movements. I'm trying to now draw and compare where is the difference. Both of these two movements had similar, to some extent, similar political opportunities. The protest started. The grievance further intensified by then one of the ministers of the cabinet. In a complete clash of interest, that minister was also an executive president of the Bangladesh Road Transport Workers Federation. It's an independent workers federation, an organization that controlled more than 200 transport unions with about 6 million members. After that incident, death of those two students while students were protesting, he callously referred to a recent, that time, road crash in India with high casualties and said with a smile, do they talk about it like way we do? Like, these students are protesting here, and there were instances that instantly there were some buses were burned down by the students instantly. So there was this comparison. He was comparing the incident in India and what has been happening here with a smile. The protesters demanded, that was outraged everybody in the whole country. And mind that these protesters are very young age, students of higher school students, highest at the age range of 15 and 16, very wearing school uniforms. Instantly, the protesters demanded immediate resignation of the minister, which was never made. And students of different schools and colleges joined them and demanding justice for the incident that took over traffic management, which was chaotic, by the way, in Bangladesh. They created, and they took the protesters not only protesting, not only demanding justice, they started to show how to manage traffic, they started to create that what they are demanding, how to manage traffic, what is justice in their sense. For the course of the movement in the next couple of days, the students didn't simply block the roads and demonstrated peacefully. They took over responsibility of traffic police and immaculately modeled and carried out a better traffic management. They created different lanes for rapid and slow vehicles respectively, which was never in the case of Bangladesh in past. The vehicles were required to stay within the designated lanes. They started to they created checkpoints in different places and got support from mass people. They didn't get anybody away with illegalities, from police officers to influential political figures, including ministers. So the zeitgeist of the movement from the very beginning was structural reform of the whole system and accountability for everyone, which was epitomized by the action of the protesters on the street. And there have been some ingenious slogans. They showed placard which said, roads are closed, state repairs going on, sorry for the momentary inconveniences, and so on. And now the problem here is, in the beginning, the response of the government towards the movement was lenient. Of course, because they are doing well. And for those 2 days, the city of Dhaka was, according to my interviews and that were in the news, peaceful streets, most peaceful streets in the perhaps history. So the government promised to enact a new set of, they again come up with some sort of token promises, but the students were adamant and skeptic of those token promises. At this point, rumors started to spread out that the oppositional political parties are involved in this protest. They're influencing the protest. At the same time, the movement was hit by the informal, unofficial violence from ruling party, political party actors. Now, these adults and students were attacked brutally by student and youth organizations of the ruling government, where police stood as mere spectators. There were many children, these students were arrested, and 51 police case was charged, but there were no case or action was taken against those who were attacked, the students and journalists. In reaction to alleged online falsehood, government temporarily prohibited mobile internet access. In the face of all around repression. Presumably and understandably, the protesters presented, all on a sudden, there were this 9-point demand condemning the attacks on them, and as well as some desired reform in the whole transportation and traffic system. The interesting thing is, nobody knows where this 9-point demand, from which source, come from. All on a sudden, this 9-point demand in the media. Here is the problem of this movement. I demand that.
Sorry, Shoykot, I am very sorry. Could you please sum up? Because we sort of have some schedule, and I thought you would just summarize your article maybe in 5, maximum 10 minutes. So now it's, do you have more to say, much more?
No, not more, just 2 minutes. Let me sum up in 2 minutes.
Yeah, please.
Okay. So the first thing is that both of these movements are partially successful, but one movement is more successful than the other. The protests started a spontaneous reaction to the system and emerged with little political mediation. In both cases, they had similar level of political opportunity to some extent. Both movements were partially successful, but the quota reform movement was comparatively more successful than the other, considering that quota was abolished. This is due to the strategic framing process and strong mobilizing structure of the quota reform movement. In both cases, protesters petered out inimical to the state and non-state informal ruling party-led and state-aided violence, and with unwritten token promises from the authority. In the case of quota reform movement, the protesters had been able to remobilize due to the strong organizational structure, which was not the case for road safety movement. And these two movements, again, the main difference drawn can be drawn from the mobilizing structure, and this created a new dimension in the history of student movements in the country. And I believe here I can finish it. Thank you very much.
So, colleagues, have you any comments or views about the paper? I suppose Professor Choudhury can comment something.
Thank you, Alexander. So I have a few comments on the paper itself. I have read the paper and before, and at the same time, I have so these comments are not always directly reflecting upon the argument itself, but probably to consider a few other things apart from the argument that he has made, which is very well-founded argument already, and he has made it very nicely. So comparing the mobilizing structures of two movements, he has showed that one of them had a stronger mobilizing structure, another one was less stronger. I would have few questions and suggestions. So my first question is that, that can we say that after almost 4 or 5 decades of independence of Bangladesh from 1971 to now, this is the first time that actually we see the emergence of the creation of a civil society after particularly the Shahbag movement, which became very famous, the biggest new social movement in the world that happened in 2000. And then after that, we see the creation of a very strong civil society whereby movements are emerging without the support of different political parties. So movements emerging without the support of political parties is a comparatively new phenomena that we see in Bangladesh. Prior to this, most of the movements had some kind of linkages to political parties. So, I would like your comment on that. And the second thing is we have to slightly, go more into the history, and from the description that you have provided about these movements and the framing that you have provided, the theories that you have elaborated upon, it seems that, this movement is actually a very modern movement. Bangladesh society otherwise, in comparison, even if some comparison can be done, it's a newly independent society. It was just created in 1970s. Of course, it has a very long history, which is kind of connected with the history of the subcontinent, of colonialism, colonization of the largest subcontinent, and then creation of Pakistan and then Bangladesh. So on the one hand, why it is extremely modern, because the kind of theories that you have actually used, resource mobilization theory, has a very modern underpinning. It talks about organizations, it talks about different kinds of relations between organizations, different kind of resources that has been used. It does not actually talk so much about the long lineages or the roots of the movement, which on the other hand, the new social movement theory talks about. So we know that Bangladesh was a part of a colonized space. So until 1947, it was part of India, it was colonized by the British, then it got independence, it became part of Pakistan, and then further it got its independence in 1970 from Pakistan to form a country on its own. Now, so there is actually a very long history and long lineage. However, that does not get reflected in the movement itself. These long historical dimensions, there are different kind of articulations, there are different kind of repertoires that they are present in these long history that should have been reflected, but nevertheless, as you have studied and as many others have studied, that these movements does not really reflect those historical dimensions. They are very modern in terms of framing, in terms of the way they organize the movement. So why do you think that is the case, despite having a long, very long history and very long lineages of movements, of wars, of student movements that has taken place in a country, which is just, independent, still shows an extremely modern movement repertoire, movement organization in a relatively quote unquote unmodern space. So the space is relatively unmodern, but the movement is extremely modern. So these are the two kind of questions and reflections which I have on your study, and then you can start on elaborating and talk about that. That's it.
Thank you. So should we give the floor to Shaykot again?
Yeah, maybe. I don't.
We can collect. Maybe we shall collect questions and issues. What do you think, colleagues? Shaykot, what do you like the best?
No, as you like. I can comment instantly. I can reply instantly, or after collectively. I have no preference actually.
I think we collect the comments, and then you maybe write a little bit and systematize it simultaneously, and then respond. Okay, and then Linda will also comment, or maybe Linda would, if you like, you comment also now. Okay, dear colleagues, do you have other questions or comments? Please don't hesitate to express yourself.
I could make a couple of comments now.
Yes, please.
Okay, I thought your paper was really well done, very nicely structured, very well selected case studies. Your use of theory and explanation of theory was all really fine. There's just I have a couple of comments. One is small, which is that in your abstract, you say that the significant difference was mobilizing structures and that framing was more or less similar. But that's not what you argue. So you argue that framing and mobilizing structures were stronger with the quota movement. So you need to just fix that. There's just a couple of points that I wanted to make. So there are two things to think about. One is how the movements get mobilized, and the other is how successful they are. And obviously their degree of success depends partly on their mobilization, maybe not entirely. So there are just two factors I thought you could maybe elaborate on a little. That is the question of who benefits if these changes are made and who stands to lose. So you don't really say whether there was resistance to the quota movement by groups that lost preferences. Did they organize to retain those preferences? Did they make any protests? it seems that the demand was made, changed from to modify the system partly so that there wouldn't be as much opposition. But the other thing is that the beneficiaries of the quota system, there's one substantial group, the heirs of the 1971 liberation struggle. And then there are a number of small groups, women, backward districts, ethnic minorities. So these groups are dispersed, right? It would not be easy for them to mobilize in opposition. And that's also a factor. I mean, when you look at a movement, you also have to look at the opposition to it. And it would be, I think, useful to say whether there was opposition to the quota reform movement. But I think the fact that there wasn't has partly to do with the group that would lose was small and it was dispersed. And those people didn't really know who they were. Some 10% of women, some 10% of backward districts. That's not a group of people who could identify themselves and organize against the movement, although there was opposition in the past. Whereas with the quota movement, the group that benefits is educated young people at universities. They're a much more coherent group. They're large, they interact, they have a clear common interest. They're a much more concentrated group of beneficiaries. And I think that is also a factor. With the road safety movement, you talk at one point about the Bangladesh Road Transport Workers Federation as one of the oppositions that had influence with the government. I wish you'd say a little more about that, and because there wasn't I assume there wasn't a similar kind of opposition to the quota movement. So maybe put a little more attention on resistance or opposition to the road safety movement. Other thing is that the people who would gain from the road safety movement, it's a very dispersed group of people, pedestrians, users of public transportation. Maybe many people would benefit in the end, but it's hard to organize a group that big. Everyone benefits, but no one specifically. Maybe even students aren't as invested in a movement that might have some benefit for them. They might not get hit by a car, but it isn't as obvious as the benefit from the quota movement. There's just one other point I want to make, and I'm not quite sure how to work this in terms of different outcomes. What the government would actually have to do to satisfy either of these two movements is very different. Changing the quota system, in an administrative sense, that's easy. The government controls the system, it makes the rules. In terms of process, it's easy to change the rules. The government just has to write a new set of criteria and send them down to its administrators. Like pension reform, as a process, it's very easy to make a change in a rule that the government controls. Changing the system of road safety is a much more complicated change. It involves many people, many actors, many interests, many rules, enforcement of those rules. You talk about the zeitgeist of the movement was structural reform of the whole system and accountability for everyone. It's much more difficult for the government to do that. And it's just something I don't know whether that's part of opportunity structure or it's something else entirely, but what the government has to do to meet these demands, I think, is also a factor. The road safety movement, I mean, it's just infinitely more complicated and requires many more resources than to just change the rules for this, for the quota system. So those are just two things, factors I think you could think about more. Thank you.
Thank you, Linda, for the comments. So if we have any comments, please, colleagues.
Oh, sorry, I have one question. Is that, so for this paper, is that you want to compare with those two movements, or you just want to choose two cases? Hello?
Yes,
I'm
I
sorry.
think yes.
Lina, can you say it again, please?
Okay, so for this paper, you want to compare with those two movements, or you just want to choose two specific cases?
Okay.
So that's my question.
I wrote it down. Yes.
Oh, okay. And I also have maybe some comments. Is that when I read it, is that because mostly my studies focus on the quantitative part, so I'm sorry that I will give some comments from the quantitative views. Is that is it possible that you add some tables maybe before the conclusion part, and to write some keywords for those two movements, because is that you have already mentioned in the conclusion is that the first one is more successful than the second one, and maybe that you can write down which time point is the key point for the students, like to show their movement or something else. Do you think it's possible? Yeah. Maybe it will be easier for the readers to understand what's the different or what's the similarity between those two movements. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, thank you, Lina. So, check out. The floor is yours. We can start from the first question, I suppose.
Yes. Thank you very much for your constructive comments. So the first question I wrote down, thank you very much, Professor Arno. Yes, I think this is the first time. There have been always civil societies, but yes, this is the first time emerging independent sort of civil society beyond the influence, heavy influence from whoever in the government. So there have been civil societies, but they were heavily influenced, entailed by the influence of the ruling government. Yes, this is the first case that emerging of an independent civil society. And I also hinted in my paper that this also is a sort of a new dimension in the emerging dimension in the social movements. Bangladesh has, I discussed it a little bit, the history of social movements has always been heavily involved by students, led by students. But those movements actually always have been with, again, patronage, with heavy patronage, heavy influence by different political parties. Now, this is the first time, and these are the first cases in the history of the country that outside of this influence, this new sort of social movements led by students, primarily led by students, are emerging. Yes, this is a new case. And the second one is actually involved. I actually did not, if you please ask that question again, it was so elaborative that I did not comprehend what I have to comment on. Could you please kindly?
Yeah, very briefly, what I mean was that the kind of movement that you have given in examples for your study, it seems to be a movement which is extremely modern in its organization structure and everything, the way they communicate, the political communication and everything. On the one hand, Bangladesh is independent, is a country which has just got its independence a few decades ago. I mean, if you compare it in 1970s, much more younger than many other countries of the world. The political scenario and the social scenario is also, quote unquote, not that modern. And at the same time, it has a very long lineage of various kinds of movements, including its independent movement in 1970s from Pakistan, its earlier movement in 1947 in the British, along with the colonial India. So it virtually got two times independence, right? Once in 1947 and then finally in 1971. So with such a long history of independence movements, with this, such long histories and stories spun around that, there must be some very long lineages that should have emerged in history for this movement. On the other hand, quite contradictorily, we see that none of these histories and lineages actually matters for this movement, and it comes up with a very modern characteristics in a society which is not so modern. So I'm trying to ask that, why is that so? Why do you think that none of these old lineages have much effect on the movement itself? We should have expected that a movement with a very long, historical repertoires, with long connection with past, with independence movement later on, that might have emerged. But we see a movement which is anti-memory, which is not connected with the memorial dimensions of all these. Why is that so? So that was my question.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I think the part of the answer lies into your previous question. It actually relates to the previous question. So, since for the first time a new sort of civil society is emerging, partly, and again, the answer could be similar to the previous one. Why? The question should be why this new civil society and these new movements are emerging. Partly, this current government is in its tenure for a very long time now. It's been 14 years. Now, this is the government, this is the party who led essentially the liberation war back in 1971. This was the biggest party, led the liberation war. In this tenure, after a very long time, they got into the power back in 2008. They overused sort of this ideological part of this glorious part of the country. They overused for their benefits, because when a country, when a government cannot provide substantially materially for the goodness of people, they tend to rely on heredity, they tend to rely on heritage, they tend to rely on glory, and they oversell it to the people. What happened was, in public imaginary, people become less enchanted by this, and it's been 50 years. The independent war was in 50 years. So this is partly, I believe, that there was this disconnection from this past movements to this present sort of modern movements. So I think I can imagine that could be one of the explanation. And also these movements, these two modern movements, are very issue based, not ideological in some sort, not in identity based. So these are very materialistic issue based.
Thank you.
I'm sorry. So, yes. So to fix the argument, as I want to comment on Dr. Cook's questions and comments. I think I argued that for both of the movements, political opportunity and mobilizing structure was similar, especially political opportunities for both of those movements were there. But the main difference was in mobilizing structure and in framing process, and mostly in framing process. That was my primary argument. So yes, I will go back to my paper, and if there, I will try to fix it. Thank you very much. And there were another question was those who lost the other parties, those who lost quota, were they dispersed? Yes, but again, what I said right now to Professor Arnab's question, that from the public imagination, the glory, they're not that much enchanted by the glory anymore because it was oversold. That's the reason that other parties, those who lost the quota, did not get much of public support. And also, the demand of the movement was not abolishment. It was kind of a political gain from the part of government. And they tried to show that this protesters, this movement was a selfish movement. They doesn't believe in liberty and so on. They're not secular. That was part of, and they abolished it. Nobody demanded abolishment of the quota. So on that, and yes, both of those movements are very different in their demands. Now, I think I could not, again, I will go back to my paper. I will try to elaborate it more in the case of that. In both movements, there were different parties. In road safety movement, the party of this workers' federation. Actually, this federation is, as it sounds very, 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 very sweet, very good, that people, these are workers' federation. The case in the field is very different. This federation is one of the most sort of, people call it colloquially that these are mafia organizations. This is a mafia organization, right? And this is very monopolized. 3 or 4 people dominated the transport industry in the country. And these people are always in the government. Which government might it be? They're always in the government as cabinet ministers. One way or the other, they're very influential people. And people colloquially say that and the condition of those who work in transport industry is just inhumane. Bear in mind that Bangladesh is the country with highest casualties in roads. Just before this movement emerged, 10,000, by government statistics, more than 10,000 people died in the roads. So it's the highest casualties in the world. And why? Most of the cases, the drivers don't have any proper agreement. Most of the time they work more than 48 hours simultaneously without any sleep, any rest whatsoever. And these 3 or 4 people, that's why this called as kind of mafia organization. And that's how they influenced. And yes, again, it's a very great task, but these demands were not very new. It has been the safer roads in the public perception, in the public demands for a very long time. That's why it was not very new. It was in public discussion, but none of the governments did nothing for that. So now, I hope I answered Dr. Cook's comments. Now go to Liana Fu's. Yes, I compared both of. I took this. Actually, this is part of my PhD project. This paper is part of my PhD projects. So in my project as a whole, I studied until now 6 movements. So these 2 are part of those movements. And what I'm doing is I'm comparing in this particular movement, particular paper, I'm comparing these 2 movements. Now, the problem with quantification of the degree of success in these movements, as you suggested, whether there can be some tables, there can be some quantification. The problem is the degree of success is so different in these movements. I cannot seem to put any numbers of the degree of success in these movements. I will consider it, but yes, I'll try. I'll think about it. But it's very hard to put numbers. It's hard to quantify the degree of success, since these 2 movements are very kind of in their nature of the demand is very different. These are not very similar sort of, so it's very hard to quantify the degree of success.
No, you don't have to add numbers. I think is that you just need to mention about what's the, as you say, you want to compare with those two movements. So what's the difference? What's the similarity? I think that's not enough. And also you want to add about the student movement. So I think it's kind of like for each part, there are not too much connections. So that's why, as you say, I can really understand that's a part of your PhD project. So you have to explain to the readers why you only choose those two or not other four, right?
Yeah, there's an explanation why I did choose those.
Mm-hmm.
It was.
I know is that I read it, but I think is the connection is not strong. It's like the first time I read it as far. I think the first one is talk about the justification. The justice, and the second one is talk about the safety. So why you choose those two of them? So, but I think if you maybe explain some, add some arguments from the Dr. Cook's part, then I can really understand. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's why I not add some quantitative. It's just suggest you add some tables to make it easier for your readers to understand. Yeah. So
yeah. So there is my answer. The primary answer why I choose these two movements, particularly here. Again, these are part of those 6 movements. And why I chose those 6 movements? Because, as you can see, my PhD project is to understand why in this particular period of time, despite mass grievances, despite social, political, economic issues, there have been almost no big movements, unlike many other countries in the world. You know, this global protest cycle in Tahrir Square, in Egypt, in Algeria, there have been many protest movements, but very interestingly, despite mass grievances, we have severe political issues, social, economic issues, but surprisingly, there have been no movements. Now, these 6 movements are the rare instances, the rare cases that these movements have happened after that period. That's the reason I tried to understand after studying this movement that there have been not much movement in this span after post 2013 up until now. There have not been that many movements. That's why I chose these movements as case studies to understand. And that's the answer to you this question, why these 2 movements, because these 2 are part of those 6. I hope I elaborate and I clarified it.
But there's a problem is that other readers won't know that you have 6 movements. Yeah.
Yes,
so for them, they can only understand you choose 2 movements and want to compare them together. A little pity. So is that maybe you can mention some in the future direction or something else?
Yes, that's good. Yes, I can. Yes, why not? Yes, sure. I can lay some context in the introduction, of course.
Yeah, then I can understand there's a whole picture and you choose 2 of them. Yeah. Good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, colleagues.
If we have any comments yet, Shaikot, could you have any ideas where you're going to publish your article? It's like my personal wondering.
I'm still
what
not
kind of journal?
Where would I publish it?
Yeah, where are you going to publish it, or where you're going to apply it? Do you know, or you haven't idea yet?
Okay.
Which journal? Yes.
I submitted in one Q2 journal named Social Identities.
So, okay, yeah, thank you. So
Okay,
it's
thank you very much.
Actually, I want to, if I may, I want to ask Professor Cook one very interesting. She laid out a very interesting point actually in the, when she was discussing this evolution of the theory in the social movements. May I ask one question? As you said, Lenin was perhaps the first resource mobilist. Yeah. I wonder whether at that point, since resource mobilization theory was actually developing in 1970s, whether at that part it was still kind of developed as a theory, or how would Lenin actually comprehend these ideas? I wonder, and could you please?
I think he was an empiricist. He comprehended them by looking at the failures of social democratic movements in Europe. And he said the workers' grievances are very real and compelling, but the leadership compromises itself. It joins the political elites of these countries. It doesn't provide the revolutionary leadership for the workers. And then it develops a reformist ideology. And he said what we need is a revolutionary leadership. And he thought the workers really didn't fully understand their interests. They understood that they were exploited, but they didn't understand the whole structure of their exploitation. And a leadership that really understood that and that was theoretically sophisticated and committed to the revolution was needed to organize their grievances into a revolutionary movement. He concluded that just by his observations and criticisms of European social democracy and why it was not fulfilling, Marx's expectations of revolution. So he was a brilliant man, and he was just looking empirically at he had a set of expectations about what should happen, and then he tried to figure out why that wasn't happening, and that was where he came up, where he developed this analysis. And then, of course, he made leadership and organization almost by far the biggest part, in the end had that's bad consequences. But that's how, as far as I know.
Thank you.
I also have several questions to Linda, but more about general discussion about social movements and welfare state that is Linda's most favorite topic. We know that Espen Andersen has written in his famous 3 Rules of Welfare Capitalism that in some welfare regimes, the social movements, public movements had played a more important role than in the others. So could you please elaborate on this, how social or public movements affect or impact welfare policies, and maybe how does it differ in various welfare regimes? And yeah.
I just want to say one other brief thing first that I keep thinking about. There was a huge protest in France years ago, provoked by the deaths of two young men. They were being chased by the police for some kind of the usual identity checks, and they climbed a fence that was and were electrocuted. And it just strikes me how similar the spark was. But of course, the other issues were different. They had to do with ethnic identity and police abuses. I just thought of it. Anyway, to Elena's question, yes, social movements. So social benefits are one of the most common objectives of social movements, especially those that are distributed to many people. And then if the government tries to reduce those benefits that have broad groups of recipients, you see protests. Contemporary France right at the moment is a great example. There's huge protests against the pension reform, and they're actually going over into protests against the whole constitutional system because of the way Macron made those changes without going through the legislature. But the general argument from Espen Andersen is that social democratic welfare systems are the strongest politically, because almost everybody has a vested interest in maintaining those benefits. So France is pretty much a social democratic system, and that it's very difficult for any government to take them away. And if it tries, if it does, it is at risk of provoking huge society-wide protests. In Russia as well, pension protests were among the most, the largest, because such a large group of people that really depend on those benefits is affected. So systems that give broad benefits are seen as more easily defended by protests and more likely to be defended by protests. The liberal systems are seen as the weakest because they tend to divide up benefits and to create separate programs for people who are poor, and poor people are a much smaller group in society. They have fewer resources. They're less likely to mobilize, they're less able to mobilize. And so the kinds of benefits in those systems, especially those that go to poorer groups, are considered much more vulnerable. And the United States is a perfect example. We've had many, many cuts in benefits of programs that go to the poor, while the middle class programs like pensions and Medicare and mortgage interest benefits are kept in place. Britain, which is another liberal state, welfare state, the same thing happened there during the reforms after 2008. There were huge cuts across the welfare system, but the most heavily cut programs were those that went more to the poor, and the better protected programs were like the National Health Service and pensions. They had some cuts, but many fewer. So those that go to middle class groups in liberal systems are better protected than those that go to the poor. So in social democratic systems, because benefits are much more evenly distributed, they all tend to be better protected. I guess that would be my main answer. Conservative systems, I don't have so much of a sense about them. People who talk about protests, I don't think there's any conventional wisdom about them. It's mostly the contrast between the liberal systems and the universalist systems and the kind of segmented systems, and their different political fates.
Yes. Thank you very much, Linda. I have another couple of questions, if you don't mind. One is related to a very interesting situation in Russia, and as I know, in other post-communist states, but I'm not sure about Bangladesh or United States or other countries of the world. In Russia, we do have such an official legal entity type, which is called social movement, социальное движение, общественное движение. So anybody can register such non-governmental organizations that will be called social movement or public movement, and it will be just an organization. It will be a non-governmental, non-profit organization, and there are different examples of such organizations that are called social movements. So how would do you understand, and maybe Shoykot and Linda and Arnab, when you are talking about social movements, are they actually legal entities? Are they officially recognized as legal registered organizations, or it's just a group of people that have similar goals and identities?
Shoykot, do you want to speak to that?
We understand social movement absolutely on the contrary. This is definitely not legal. Actually, these are illegal activities. People are demanding in the streets, protesting. And whenever you register to, as in Russia, as you said, it actually, I think, theoretically not considered social movement anymore. It becomes civil society whenever you register. And we understand, our understanding in the case of Bangladesh, our understanding of social movement is just not registered. It's very much anomal relation between public and state. So that's our understanding of actually social movements.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, sorry, I just wanted to say that we have the same understanding in Russia in sociology, of course, and in society, but I just wanted to share with you this information, a tricky fact that we have such a type of legal entity.
I mean, I agree completely with Shaikot about the difference between social movements and organizations. But going back to welfare states, in the United States, for example, we have many organizations that are strictly that anybody can join. Like the best example is the American Association of Retired People, which is a huge organization. And it has a great deal of influence in the government. Now, there might be protests, but but that organization is more critical because it has a huge membership. You sign up and pay $5. It collects information on the voting records of everyone in the legislature, and it sends out messages to people about, who's defending pension rights and who's not. So that organization has a major, in a way, we probably don't need protests because that organization is really defending those rights, and it's formal, it's very well organized. And I know there are others, but that's the most famous because it's prevented. Reagan privatized everything that he could, but he couldn't privatize pensions because we have this huge organizational block. So organizations can be very important in defending benefits once they've been established.
Thank you all very much for helping us to feel that we are not alone, and we are doing this work together with our colleagues, also in our very warm team in the lab. We wish you, Shaikot, good, smooth way of revising your paper. So we hope maybe some version of this paper you could submit to some Russian journal for faster publication. Please consider such an option. I think it would be good decision because it might even be published this year, which is important for your PhD program. Yes, and thanks a lot, Linda. You made this seminar. I think it was wonderful discussion. Thank you very much, Arnab, and everybody who participated. Thank you very much, Alexander, for arranging, and also Natasha for the big work on arrangement of this seminar. Thanks a lot, dear colleagues. Have a nice evening, and Linda, have a nice day.
Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Elena. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you so much for it. So we will wait for the another announcements for the next seminars, I suppose. So we will inform you by the email.
Yes, I'll email you today about times.
Okay.
Thank you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.